Ja, ein paar wichtige Worte vorab. Im Publikum besteht während der gesamten Veranstaltung Maskenpflicht, also bitte schützen Sie sich und andere, indem Sie Ihren Mund-Nasenschutz nicht abnehmen. Nach etwa einer Stunde sind wir verpflichtet zu einer etwa 10-minütigen Lüftungspause. Falls Sie in dieser Pause Ihren Platz verlassen sollten, denken Sie bitte an die markierten Laufrichtungen, wahren Sie ausreichend Abstand und lassen Sie in den Innenräumen ebenfalls den Mund-Nasenschutz auf. Für Hände können Sie auch die bereitgestellten Desinfektionsmittel nutzen. Auch für den Erwerb von Büchern möchte ich da um eine strikte Wahrung der entsprechenden Hygiene- und Abstandsregeln bitten. Das als kleines Corona-bedingtes Intro. Ja, herzlich willkommen im Namen des Literaturforums im Brechthaus hier im Saal oder auch am Bildschirm. Ich freue mich sehr, dass der Klimaaktivist und Humanökologe Andreas Malm heute Abend bei uns ist und die Unwägbarkeiten einer Einreise aus Schweden ins Corona-Krisengebiet Deutschland auf sich genommen hat. Andreas Malm wird gleich hier auf dem Podium nachrücken. Zur Zeit hat er noch im Publikum Platz genommen. Andreas Malm hat das geschrieben, was man ein Buch der Stunde nennen muss. Klima, Klimax, so lautet der Titel, und es geht um nichts Geringeres als die Krise als neuen Normalzustand. Das Jahr 2019, wir erinnern uns, stand ganz im Zeichen der Klimakrise. Das Jahr 2020 nun steht, obwohl sich ja im Hinblick auf die Klimakrise, die Klimakatastrophe ja gar nichts geändert hat, als doch letztlich noch weitaus herausfordernderes Krisenszenario. Auf genau diese Situation macht Andreas Malm aufmerksam und er fordert radikale Wege zur Rettung des Klimas, mindestens so radikal, wie wir das im Falle der Corona-Krise tagtäglich erleben. Nicht umsonst heißt ein weiterer Band, ein Buchtitel von Andreas Malm, der ebenfalls gerade auf Deutsch erschienen ist, wie man eine Pipeline in die Luft jagt. Beide Bücher sind bei Mattes und Seitz Berlin erschienen. Der Verlag Mattes und Seitz ist Kooperationspartner dieser Veranstaltung. Auch im Namen des Verlags möchte ich Sie herzlich willkommen heißen. Das Gespräch mit Andreas Malm wird in englischer Sprache stattfinden. Gesprächspartnerin ist Birgit Schneider. Birgit Schneider ist Professorin für Medienökologie an der Universität Potsdam. Seit vielen Jahren schon beschäftigt sie sich mit Fragen von Ökologie und Medien, von der Wahrnehmung von Umwelt und Klima und Klimakatastrophe, so schon 2009 im Rahmen eines Forschungsprojekts zum Thema Klimabilder. Zu genau diesem Thema ist 2018 auch eine Publikation erschienen, Klimabilder, eine Genealogie globaler Bildpolitiken von Klima und Klimawandel. Auch diese Studie ist bei Mattes und Seitz Berlin erschienen. Bevor wir jetzt gleich ins Englische wechseln und in die Diskussion gehen, werden wir einleitend eine Passage aus der deutschen Übersetzung von Klima, Klimax hören. David Frühauf, der Übersetzer des Buchs, wird aus dem Buch lesen und uns auf diese Weise in das Gespräch einstimmen. Damit reiche ich das Wort an unser Podium weiter. Mein Name ist Christian Nippe, schön, dass Sie mit dabei sind und lassen Sie uns unser Podium nochmal mit einem großen Applaus begrüßen.
Thank you very much, and also a warm welcome from me to all you people who are here in this space with us, but also, of course, to the people who might watch this talk on YouTube. So I'm happy to listen to the first pages of the book.
Die dritte Dekade des Jahrtausends begann mit der Unterzeichnung eines weiteren historischen Konjunkturpakets zur Förderung der dystopischen Vorstellungskraft. Buschfeuer fegten über Australien hinweg, äscherten ein Gebiet ein, das größer war als Österreich und Ungarn zusammengenommen, ließen Flammen 70 Meter in den Himmel aufschießen, verbrannten 34 Menschen und mehr als 1 Milliarde Tiere, entsandten Rauchfahnen über den Pazifischen Ozean bis nach Argentinien und färbten den Schnee über den neuseeländischen Bergen braun, als ein Virus auf einem Lebensmittelmarkt in der chinesischen Stadt Wuhan ausbrach. Auf dem Markt wurden in der Wildnis gefangene Tiere verkauft. Es gab Wolfswelpen im Angebot, Bambusratten, Singzikaden, Stachelschweine, aber auch Eichhörnchen, Füchse, Ziebertkatzen, Schildkröten, Salamander, Krokodile und Schlangen. Als Quelle des Virus aber nannten erste Studien Fledermäuse. Von diesem Wirt, so hieß es, sei das Virus auf eine andere Spezies übergegangen. Schuppentiere galten dabei als Hauptverdächtige und dadurch auf den Markt von Wuhan gelangt, wo ihm der Sprung auf einige der an den Geschäften entlang flanierten gelungen sei. Schon bald suchten PatientInnen scharenweise die Krankenhäuser auf. Einer der ersten, ein abgesehen davon vollkommen gesunder 41-jähriger Mann, der auf dem Markt arbeitete, hütete eine Woche lang mit Fieber, enge Gefühle in der Brust, trockenem Husten und anderweitigen Beschwerden das Bett, bevor er hastig auf die Intensivstation gebracht wurde. Zufälligerweise stiegen während genau dieser Woche auch die Temperaturen in den betroffenen australischen Bundesstaaten auf über 40 Grad. Kurz danach breitete sich das Virus wie ein elektromagnetischer Impuls über die ganze Welt aus. Anfang Februar 2020 starben täglich rund 50 Menschen, meist an akuter Atemnot und Atemversagen. Anfang März lag die Zahl der Opfer weltweit bereits bei 70 Menschen pro Tag. Anfang April, bei mittlerweile 5000 Toten täglich, stand die exponentielle Wachstumskurve beinahe senkrecht. Mit mindestens einem Infektionsfall in 182 von 202 Ländern hatte der tödliche Impuls jeden Ozean überquert und fegte von Belgien bis Ecuador durch die Straßen, während zur gleichen Zeit Heuschreckenschwärme größer und dichter als je zuvor erinnert oder aufgezeichnet Ostafrika und Westasien überzogen. Sie bedeckten das Land, fraßen Pflanzen und Früchte und ließen kaum einen Fleck Grün zurück. Vergeblich versuchten die Bauern, sie von den Feldern zu vertreiben. Heuschreckenwolken verdunkelten den Himmel und ihre Körper türmten sich in rauen Mengen auf, sobald die Insekten tot zu Boden fielen, dicht genug, dass selbst Züge vor ihnen Halt machen mussten. Ein einzelner lebender Schwarm in Kenia umfasste ein 3-mal so großes Gebiet wie New York City. Ein üblicheres Aufgebot bestünde aus einem 24. dieser Größe, das bis zu 8 Milliarden Lebewesen umfassend immer noch in der Lage wäre, die gleiche Menge zu verschlingen wie 4 Millionen Menschen an einem Tag. Unter normalen Bedingungen kommt es nur äußerst selten zu solch riesigen Schwärmen. Ging es nach ihr selbst, würde die Heuschrecke an ihrem solitären Lebensstil in der Wüste festhalten. Doch 2018 und 2019 wurden eben diese Wüsten von außergewöhnlichen Wirbelstürmen und sintflutartigen Regengüssen heimgesucht, die sich in einem derartigen Feuchtigkeitsüberschuss niederschlugen, dass die Zahl der Heuschreckeneier regelrecht explodierte und somit zur Gefahr für die Nahrungsmittelversorgung von zig Millionen Menschen erwuchs. Und zwar in genau jenem Moment, in dem das Virus über die Welt hereinbrach. Kein apokalyptischer Reiter sitzt allein zu Pferd. Seuchen tauchen nicht im Singular auf. Es hat ganz den Anschein, als müssten wir auch noch mit Geschwüren und Viehpest und stinkenden Flüssen und toten Fischen und Fröschen rechnen. Zum Zeitpunkt der Niederschrift in den ersten Tagen des April 2020 kratzt die Gesamtzahl der während der Corona-Pandemie registrierten Fälle an der Schwelle von 1 Million Infizierter. Während die Zahl der Toten bereits die 50.000er Marke überschritten hat und niemand weiß, wie all das enden wird. Um Lenin zu paraphrasieren, es ist, als ob Jahrzehnte in Wochen gepfercht worden wären, die Welt dreht sich mit immer größerer Geschwindigkeit, sodass jegliche Prognose Gefahr läuft, sich lächerlich zu machen. Da nun jedoch auch uns ein Teil des Dystopie-Konjunkturpakets zugefallen ist, scheinen wir zumindest problemlos in der Lage zu sein, uns einen fiebrigen Planeten vorzustellen, auf dem Menschen mit Fieber leben. Ein Planeten, auf dem es globale Erwärmung und Pandemien gibt, Slums, die im Meer versinken und Menschen, die beispielsweise in Mumbai an einer Lungenentzündung sterben. So wurde etwa im Slum Dharavi bereits der erste Fall einer Coronavirus-Infektion gemeldet. 1 Million Menschen lebt dort auf engstem Raum mit minimalem Zugang zu sanitären Einrichtungen. Sturmfluten mit riesigen Wassermassen brechen jedes Jahr über den Slum herein. Es ist ein Planet, auf dem es Flüchtlingslager gibt, in denen sich Krankheitserreger wie an einer Zündschnur entlang durch dicht gedrängte Körper fressen. Ein Planet, auf dem es viel zu heiß und viel zu ansteckend ist, um nach draußen zu gehen, auf dem Felder unter der Sonne rissig werden, ohne dass jemand sie bestellt. Dessen ungeachtet aber ging die Corona-Krise von Anfang an mit dem Versprechen einher, Man werde zur Normalität zurückkehren. Und dieses Versprechen war ungewöhnlich laut und glaubwürdig, zumal dieses Übel dem gesellschaftlichen System weitaus fremder zu sein schien als etwa der Crash einer Investmentbank. Das Virus war der Inbegriff eines exogenen Schocks. Man nahm daher an, dass es schon im nächsten oder übernächsten Monat verpuffen werde. Möglicherweise würde es eine zweite Welle erleben, aber damit hätte sich die Angelegenheit auch erledigt. Spätestens ein Impfstoff würde den Keim der Pandemie ersticken. Insofern wurde jede Maßnahme, die zur Eindämmung des Virus ergriffen wurde, gleich einer Straßenabsperrung der Polizei lediglich als vorübergehend angepriesen, damit wir uns mühelos dem Bild eines Planeten hingeben konnten, der geradewegs in den Status quo ante zurückversetzt wird. Straßen, die sich wieder füllen, EinkäuferInnen, die erleichtert ihre Gesichtsmasken abstreifen und in die Einkaufszentren drängen. Und all jene, die den aufgeschauten Drang verspüren, genau dort weiterzumachen, wo sie vor dem Virus die Arbeit niedergelegt hatten. Sie werden sich geradezu begeistert diesem Bild hingeben, die Rückkehr der Flugzeuge im Firmament, der geradezu nachwinterlich sprießende Baldachin aus weißen Kondensstreifen, privater Konsum, womöglich verlockender als je zuvor. Niemand, der sich nach alledem noch in einen vollbesetzten Zug oder Zug zwängen wollte. All die ungenützten Kapazitäten der Auto-, Stahl- und Kohleindustrie, die sich wieder entfalten, all die Lagerbestände, die sich endlich wieder in die Lieferketten einspeisen lassen würden, und außer Sichtweite die Ölbohrungen, zurück in voller Funktion, eifrig hämmernd. Doch bei genauerer Betrachtung stellen sich diese beiden scheinbar gegensätzlichen Zukunftsszenarien als ein und dasselbe heraus. Besteht also überhaupt noch die Möglichkeit eines Auswegs?
Dankeschön. Ja, vielen Dank an David Frühauf, der das ganze Buch in einem ziemlichen Tempo übersetzt hat. And now I will switch to English and we will swap places and welcome Andreas Malm. I think so.
Should I brought my microphone? Yeah, forgotten your microphone. Oh, yeah, sorry.
We are not allowed to use the same microphones, so I should take it in my hand. Okay. I could.
All right.
So, great to have you here.
Great to be here.
Let's talk about your book, about the book Climax. And of course, we are right in the middle of this, we are in the second wave now of this pandemia, everybody knows right now. And I just looked into the date when you finished your foreword, and it's really exactly half a year ago. On the 28th of April, you finished this book, it seems. And so now we are half a year further on this road. And I would like to start with, I work in the field of climate change communication, as it's framed sometimes. And of course, there were many people doing a comparison between corona pandemia and global warming politics, and why has there been so much action taken, so many measures, politics so strong in the face of corona, and why hasn't this been the case for 30 years with climate change or even longer? And you could say that, of course, both look at curves. So to think about corona, we are always looking at these curves, and then we take political decisions. But these curves, maybe in both cases, only show the symptoms, but not the causes. We will discuss that. And then we can see that now we all have the experience of a massive behavior change. So we know we have the common experience of a big crisis. And maybe we could build on this collective experience, people say. But then, again, it's also asked if business as usual is the catastrophe, and we will talk about this too. What will happen after the pandemia? So how can we make this a chance to change something profoundly? And I would like to start with this actually with the last paragraph, which was read to us a minute ago after the apocalyptic horsemen we were listening to, all these plagues which came across the globe this year. Could you maybe talk a little bit about the why is Corona crisis the same thing as global warming?
Yeah, okay, let me just start by thanking sich for putting out this book, and to David for translating it, and to you, Birgit, for being here and talking to me, and for all of you who've come here, despite of the situation that we have. I live in Sweden. I was here. I wrote this book during the what we would now refer to as the first wave and the first lockdown. But since 1st of May, I've been in Sweden, in Malmö. As everyone knows, Sweden doesn't have any lockdown. So I guess it's still for you unusual and uncomfortable to wear a mask and all those things. And it's even more so for us. It's very strange. Because in Sweden, virtually no one wears a mask. But it's so. In Sweden, I think still the sense of living in a pandemic is a little bit more muted than here and in most places in Europe. Yeah, okay, so there are lots of things to discuss here, but if we should start by discussing the relation between this particular pandemic and global warming and how they are the same, well, yeah, so as you laid out, there was this discussion early in the year about the relation, the comparison between this pandemic and the climate crisis, because obviously we came into this year from 2019, which was the year of the climate movement, really, the year of the high watermark, the peak so far in popular mobilizations around climate, when people demanded that this crisis be perceived as an emergency and addressed with all the sense of urgency required. And then all of a sudden the pandemic happened, and the climate movement essentially froze and became completely paralyzed and in a sense disappeared, because all social mobilization just vanished early this year. But the memory of 2019 was still fresh enough in people's minds for a lot of people to ask the question, okay, so just as you said, why can states take such dramatic measures to combat this pandemic when so little has been done about the climate crisis? So I start in the book by trying to discuss this question from a couple of different angles. And I mean, now that we're apparently moving into a second lockdown in this country and in quite a few others in Europe, I think it's quite still remarkable and something probably unheard of in the history of modern capitalism, that you have states, going in and essentially just putting all normal market activity and capital accumulation on hold. And it requires an explanation, and the contrast with the passivity in the face of the climate crisis calls out for some kind of an explanation. How is it possible that you can essentially compel people to stay at home for long periods and close down workplaces and things like that? All of these measures that are extremely disruptive in people's lives, while you can't even take minimally rational measures to combat climate catastrophe, which wouldn't have to be this disruptive and frankly painful for people. So there are, I think, I don't think that I have a full explanation for it, and I'm happy to hear what you would say and what all of you would give us an explanation. But I think there are a couple of different factors that need to be taken into account. One is that all of these measures are still advertised as temporary suspensions of business as usual. So it's not about permanently changing anything in how our economies work. At least that's not the way that it's framed initially by any politicians. It's just we have to, for the time being, take these kind of emergency measures, but then we'll go back to normal. That's been sort of implicit from the beginning. An actual transition away from fossil fuels would imply that we leave fossil fuels in the ground forever and stop digging them up, not just for a couple of months, but for as long as human civilization will be around. So these are two shifts, if you like, of different magnitudes. Another interesting factor still is that this pandemic has hit pretty affluent people. There's now a strangely long list of politicians on the right, including on the far right, that have contracted this virus without anyone being killed. But you have Jair Bolsonaro, Boris Johnson, Donald Trump. That's quite incredible that all of these three very important politicians on the right/far right in the world today all have contracted this virus, and none of them, as a person, has ever been vulnerable to the immediate impacts of climate change. Even though Donald Trump has, I think, some golf resort in Scotland or somewhere that was at risk from sea level rise or something like that, but he personally hasn't suffered any consequences, as in contracting an actual disease. Now, clearly this doesn't mean that he or Bolsonaro or Boris Johnson, for that matter, have had some kind of epiphanies and after the experience of having contracted the virus have gone out and combated it very vigilantly. That's clearly not the case. But I still think there is a difference between the two in that this coronavirus pandemic at an early stage had a massive impact on affluent people in the global north, and the moment when this pandemic was turned into and constituted as a major political and economic crisis was when it spread in northern Italy. It was not when it spread in China or in Iran, but when it came to northern Italy. And here the timeline is different from the climate crisis, which has for decades inflicted very serious damages primarily in the global south. Then it has gradually also inflicted all sorts of damages in the global north, but it's started. The suffering has always been worse in the non-white global south, whereas here it very early on came into our countries. These are some of the factors, but I'm still at a loss. I mean, I don't think that I have a full explanation for this contrast. So I'd be curious to know what you think about it.
Of course, the climate change for the people in the north is more distant, or has been more distant until 2 years ago. I think we really experienced this big shift at the moment. So it's not only the graphs, which are very abstract and which we can push into the far future anymore, but it's out there now, and this really makes a change. I think so too. But I really would like to know why, because the strong point, I think, about a very long part of your book, it's like you read all these nature articles about wildlife, animals, etc., and how the virus actually spreads, and also the history of pandemics, which didn't make it to the European headlines because they were so far away. So you write that all measures are palliative, and they only cure the symptoms. They don't cure the basic driving factors. And I think it's really important to explain, because we are so overwhelmed by the symptoms, especially today, I think, again, where we face this second lockdown, that we do hardly not hear about these driving forces. And I think this is a very important issue we have to talk about here.
Yeah, this is one of the many tragedies of the ecological crisis, that when it hits home in full force, people become so overwhelmed by the emergency that they don't ask themselves, we don't ask ourselves, what's behind this? You know, if I live in Oregon and my house is on fire, I don't start to question, so what's behind this? What do fossil fuel companies do? I try to get away from the fires and survive, and it's a similar situation now, or it's even more pronounced than in times of climate impacts, extreme weather events, because the discussion about the fundamental drivers of this kind of pandemics is, at least in Sweden, almost completely absent from the public debate about it. It's all about how do we treat this disease? How do we manage it? How do we administer the testing, vaccines, all of these things? And I would guess, as you say, it's the same here in Germany. There is very little in the way of discussion of what is causing this. Why is it happening? What's behind it? And here the contrast, again, is very big with what happened in 2018, because when we had the hot summer of 2018 with the droughts and the wildfires and all of that, people fairly quickly made the link to global warming. And I think that's partly because people had a preconception, a kind of latent understanding that something like this could happen, because for years we've had the climate movement and climate scientists telling us that something like this is coming, whereas now people have been taken, this pandemic has come as a shock, as a random event, as a bolt from the blue, as an asteroid impact, something randomly that just happens, and then we have to deal with it, and it's all about how to deal with it, and there's far less discussion about how it relates to ecological and social processes than back in the summer of 2018, when people made that link to a greater extent, and that's the moment when you had the huge, the trigger for the huge mobilization with the school strikes and Extinction Rebellion and more climate camps and things like that, and also the reaction from here, AFD in Sweden, the Sweden Democrats and other far-right parties that deny climate change. You had an intense political polarization around the climate issue following the summer of 2018. We've seen nothing like that when it comes to the problem of pandemics.
So maybe we really have to talk about this. So why are ecological withdrawal and COVID crisis intrinsically connected? Why actually we think that corona crisis, a pandemia, is like a fate, a natural fate which just comes down here like an asteroid, but it is not. So you're elaborating on deforestation, on trade flows and bushmeat trade and all these things. And why do you think that actually these connections between pandemics which occur now more often and all these ways how humans treat resources and about global markets and exploitation of grounds and the deforestation are linked together?
So this is a vastly complicated field, and I have to say that I don't have professional expertise. I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not an expert on deforestation. But from what I can gather from the scientific literature, I normally do history, but there's not so much history here. But what I gather from the scientific literature is that the key driver of the trend of more and more emerging infectious diseases of this kind is deforestation. So these pathogens, including SARS-CoV-2, the one that we're dealing with right now, this coronavirus, they are microorganisms that circulate naturally in populations of wild animals, primarily in bats. Bats are the main natural reservoirs for coronaviruses. This is a fairly new discovery. It's from the previous SARS pandemic, or epidemic, sorry, the first coronavirus epidemic of this millennium, this century, that also started in China. And since then, researchers have discovered that these coronaviruses are frequently found among bat populations. But the general phenomenon here goes far beyond coronaviruses. There are many other instances of viruses in recent decades that have jumped from wild animal populations into the human species. And this phenomenon is known as zoonotic spillover, where you have precisely this process of these naturally circulating pathogens jumping from an animal species into the human species. And this trend that we've had for decades with more and more of these new infectious diseases that almost always come from wild animals is fundamentally caused by humans disturbing the habitats where the natural carriers, the reservoir species that host those pathogens live. And the main, the principal way that humans poke around in these habitats is deforestation. When you cut down the forests where bat populations live, those bats have to go somewhere else and take their pathogens with them. Or when you cut roads through a forest and you make clear cuts to establish plantations or pastures, you establish what's called interfaces, where humans come into contact with those wild animals that carry those pathogens around them. And deforestation really is the central process here. And deforestation in turn is caused primarily by, or nowadays primarily driven by consumption in the global north. So deforestation in the tropics, where biodiversity is greatest, and where the biodiversity of, sorry, I'll switch this off completely. Where the biodiversity of pathogens is also largest. Deforestation in the tropics is nowadays primarily driven by the process of making space for the production of commodities that are then exported into the global north, notably in the form of beef, soy, palm oil, but also things like coffee and chocolate and commodities of this kind. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And I really recommend, of course, reading this chapter, because it's like 100 pages about all these connections. And it's really eye-opening, I think, what you, not being an epidemist, brought together here. So natural disasters are hybrids, and also the pandemia is a hybrid. It's not only affecting humans, but at the same time it's caused by humans. And I think this is like the bad pill of this message, which we actually need to reflect on. Another issue I would like to talk about with you is, so you also said that, of course, the framing of the pandemia is like, we will get back to business as usual. And this is the tragedy at this very moment. And so we must not go back to business as usual, as everybody knows who's familiar with all these data about the ecological crisis and other crises. But this is the framing. What is, and you say that we have a problem here with the viruses and and then you frame the capital as the patron of the parasites, actually. So I would like to talk about what is your idea of a paradigm shift, or is there, how can we get to this change, actually? But when will the business as usual stop?
When will business as usual stop? It's the question we all ask. In a strange way, this is the moment when business as usual is put on hold. I really had a kind of visceral experience when, so my partner's sitting over there, and we have relatives in Steglitz, and we had to spend some time there during the lockdown, and I remember going into one of the malls. There are a lot of malls in Steglitz, not the nicest, coolest neighborhood in this city, as you know. But you know, so many times when I've entered malls, I've had this thought that this cannot go on forever. It's by definition unsustainable. This extreme overproduction of commodities just cannot go on forever. And then I remember going into one of the malls there in Steglitz this spring, and everything was just completely deserted and closed. And I had that feeling that, okay, so now it's actually happening. This is how business as usual ends. And I guess the malls will close again now next week, and who knows for how long this will go on. We don't know. I mean, sometimes WHO says that, well, this virus will be with us forever, practically. So I mean, it could be. We could have a vaccine. Who knows? We could have a vaccine early next year, or something happen that means that we'll return to business as usual. But the political problem here is that a real break with business as usual can only be accomplished by social movements. I mean, if we're not content with just this, if you like, false break with business as usual that we're having now, where everything is just, paused, but an actual transition to another way of living, that's not going to happen by governments realizing that it's something that we need to do. Because if that were possible, it would have happened long ago. All indications are that states will have to be forced by popular pressure to even begin go down that road. Now, the problem here is that the conditions that we're living under in 2020 are extremely disadvantageous, unhelpful precisely for popular mobilization, because the one thing that is most illegal is to collect people in big numbers, right? Or illegal, yeah, illegal. It's the first thing that lockdowns ban. Crowding together, assembling a lot of people together, which is only what we can do. We don't have the money, we don't have the arms. The only thing we have, and that's always been the case, the only thing we have are numbers of people that come together and move together in streets or whatever it is. And we can't do that now, unless we're fascists like in Italy yesterday who clashed with the police to protest the lockdown. So the problem here is we have an opportunity to move beyond business as usual because business as usual is on hold, but social movements are on hold as well. The climate movement is in a state of coma or paralysis and has been since last year. Now, if I were to give some kind of strategic advice or some thoughts about how to move forward, it would be the following. I think that the climate movement and other social movements need to do like Black Lives Matter did in the spring, and that is to feel free to object to this argument. But what I think is that the climate movement and other allied social movements should start to flout and potentially ignore lockdown restrictions, just like the BLM movement did. Not because we're against those restrictions and want to fight them, like people on the far right in Italy did yesterday, and maybe here in Germany to some extent as well, but because if we want to move beyond business as usual, we have to go back into the streets again, down into the mines, into the auto fairs, and confront fossil capital and the companies that drive deforestation, and make the argument that if we don't do so, we'll get one pandemic after another. And if we don't want to be condemned to living under lockdown year after year, a new pandemic one after the other, we need a fundamental break with business as usual, and that requires that we demand it through collective mobilization. Yeah.
And I would like to quote Walter Benjamin's sentence, which I really like a lot. It's that things are status quo, business as usual is the catastrophe. And I think this is still a very important sentence here. So what you propagate, and this is something you're also doing in the very beginning of your book, is you say we need the rhetoric of war. So this is an analogy you're making here. So who are we at war with? Or how would you propagate the rhetorics of war?
Well, it's not so much that I say, oh, well, we have to have a rhetoric of war here. It's rather like there is a rhetoric of war that has accompanied this crisis from early on. Emmanuel Macron is one of those politicians who is... specialized most in this rhetoric, with constantly repeating that we have an invisible enemy that we have to combat, and this is a war against the virus and all these things. This is a particular way of speaking about a severe crisis that comes naturally when the existential stakes appear to be high. My argument is that if we're going to wage a war, it shouldn't fundamentally be a war against the symptoms, but against the drivers of this particular catastrophe, and perhaps even more of the climate catastrophe. And I make an argument there around wartime mobilization as an analogy that has been used quite frequently by the climate movement and by scholars working in climate politics that have pointed to the experience of the United States during the Second World War as a model for what we need to do now, when the American government ordered car companies, for instance, to cease producing cars and only manufacture tanks and other kinds of equipment needed for the war against Hitler, because that was the enemy to defeat. That showed that states can actually, in a short time, shift an entire apparatus of production towards another goal if the stakes are high enough. And this is an argument that the climate movement has been making for a long time. So, yeah, I have a discussion around that analogy, which has also popped up during this crisis, and discuss a little bit about why the Second World War model is limited and has limited value. And one of the key differences between the Second World War and our moment is the following. The dominant classes in the US didn't have anything to lose in the long term from wartime mobilization. They were essentially on board with it. They might have been inconvenienced for a short period by being under de facto state control, but the central material interests of the ruling classes in the US were never in question by wartime mobilization. This time, we're facing a completely different situation. Yesterday, The Guardian reported that the methane hydrates in the Arctic are now starting to be activated. Scientists have, for the first time, registered that those enormous frozen deposits of methane, a greenhouse gas that is more than 80 times more potent than CO2 in the atmosphere, although it's converted into CO2 after a few years, but still a radiative forcing, a climate impact, mind-bogglingly worse than what CO2 has. These deposits are being activated. They are seeping up through the water column and into the atmosphere, leaking out this methane. And at the same time, we have Total, the single largest capitalist corporation in France, an oil company, the single largest capitalist corporation in France, preparing to go into the Arctic with the financial support of President Macron to drill for oil. And science tells us that if we want to have any kind of possibility to avoid breaching the 1.5 degree threshold, we need to cut emissions by about 50% until 2030, I believe they say. All the major oil companies, ExxonMobil, BP, even though it's speaking in a typical greenwashing fashion about becoming carbon neutral at some date in the future, Total, Chevron, all of them are planning for expanded production of oil and gas. ExxonMobil and BP with something like 30 or 20%, Shell I think most of all in fact, until 2030. So this means that a very important segment of the dominant class, namely the fraction of capital that profits directly from the exploration and extraction of oil and gas, and also coal, of course, as you know here in Germany, this fraction of the capitalist class has to cease to exist as such. We can no longer have companies that make profit from producing fossil fuels. And that's a completely different situation from what we faced in the Second World War. So here's one of the limitations of that model. And that's why I, towards the end of the book, discuss other models.
So you would say we have to become fossil Luddites in a way. People who well, like the title of your next book coming out in German, blow up a pipeline, and but also become active in all other ways, getting political. And I think it's, maybe I go one step back, and because I just was thinking, campaigners of climate change, they get told again and again that don't give the people the doom. do not give all these shock scenarios. This is something you are doing to a large extent in your book, of course, and but then again, research has shown that if you tell if you give the really bad picture of global warming, then people feel disempowered and they want to be passive and they think, I cannot do anything, I'm much too small for this big issue. What would you think about this?
Yeah, well, my answer is very straightforward. The sentiment that we need to cultivate is anger and climate rage. Not despair, not so much fear, as being fundamentally upset about just take the report that came out a couple of weeks back that says that the richest 1% of humanity has emitted more than twice as much as the poorest half of humanity since 1990. I don't know how you can respond emotionally to such a figure with anything else than anger. Because what this means is that an extremely tiny segment of this species is ruining the planet. I mean, you don't have to back that figure up with all of the doom scenarios to make people realize that a tiny elite really is laying this planet to waste without suffering the impacts, at least initially. Or take another figure, the expansion in the share of car sales taken up by SUVs has been the second largest driver of emissions increase in the world since 2010. So the expansion in the sale of SUVs as against other types of cars is the second largest driver of global heating. And these cars fulfill no human need whatsoever. They don't even provide safety to the drivers. To the contrary, it's more dangerous even to driving those cars, because when those cars are actually crashing, the drivers and passengers suffer more injury, because these cars flip over and things like that. So these cars, who really don't have any reason to exist, otherwise than flaunting wealth, because that's what they do fundamentally. It's a form of conspicuous consumption. Although, of course, there are other psychological reasons to buy SUVs, but that's one of the central ones. These SUVs are so central to destroying this planet. How can you respond to that by anything else than anger and being upset about it? And research tells us that the one emotion that tends to drive social mobilization and change is precisely anger. What was the feeling that drove the BLM wave that we had earlier this year? Of course, it was anger. People were angry about the killing of George Floyd. And the task for the climate movement in its communication, I think, should be to make people realize that what we're seeing in the climate is also a form of violence, even though it's not as immediate as a white cop sitting on the neck of George Floyd. The violence is there, but it's structural and it's normalized and it goes on all the time, but that's not a reason not to be angry about it. Yeah.
Thank you. I think it's interesting to see that if we hope for a radical change at this moment, it's like people tell us we are stupid. So when I was reading the last chapters of your book and you were telling us about war communism and ecological Leninism, I was also thinking, if you turn up, like if I'm going to advise a campaigner doing politics for Germany, for getting CO2 neutral or whatever, and I would tell them, this is like the model. They would tell me that I'm reactionary. I'm like somebody who's taking the wrong examples because it's like so far away. But I think this is also the problem of our time, that people are called to be really reactionary or stupid if they hope for a radical change in this regard. So what would you answer? What do you answer people who are not familiar with these Marxist readings?
Would I answer people who are not familiar? Well, let me just put it this way to begin with. That I think we're in a fundamentally extreme situation with this planetary crisis, but our language, our political language, does not correspond to that severity of crisis. So, you know, experimenting with extreme terms like war, communism, or ecological Leninism is, in a way, just an attempt to, to experiment with terms that can match the magnitude of the crisis. And that's not because anything of this is palatable to people, or it's in the pipeline, on the cards, on the table, on the agenda, something that a lot of people or companies or policymakers are prone to accept and say, hurrah, we're going to have war communism. That's not the point of it. It's rather a way to, I lay out some concrete measures that I think should be taken, but the choice of these words is a way of trying to say, we have to take this for real. It is precisely that urgent. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah. It's my own little flawed, for sure, attempt to shake something up. Yeah.
And I think it's a very different way than at this moment we are reading a lot about ecosystem services. I think this is a concept to monetize nature in order to calculate it in a capitalistic way. And this is like the big hope at this moment. And I think you're propagating something profoundly different than this model. We have another 5 minutes, then we will take a break for 10 minutes, and afterwards we hope you all stay here and pose questions, so we get into the discussion, okay? So I would like to pose my last question. What is the role of technology for this big shift you're propagating? In your book, you're also thinking about a special type of geoengineering, which is emission reduction with direct air capture. But then again, you're saying that if the big things like solar radiation management, like this would be like the wrong way. What is the role of technology for you in this crisis?
Yeah, that's a very big question. I don't know if I have an answer as in I have a general view of technology and its role in this crisis, because I think that I find it hard to generalize about technology. Some technologies we have to get rid of completely, but that means that we have to replace them with something else. So if we want to completely phase out fossil fuels, that means that about 80 or even more % of the total energy production in the world today needs to be replaced with something else, unless we want to just keep the 20% that are water power, nuclear power, and a tiny bit of solar and wind. And for me, that means we don't need to replace all of that 80%, because we can imagine consuming less energy, but there are also lots of people around the world that actually need to consume more energy, including a third of the Indian population that is not connected to any kind of electricity supply. So some people in the global south actually need to consume more energy, while a lot of people in the global north need to consume less. Or maybe not a lot of people, but there needs to be reduction in energy consumption in the global north. That means that fossil fuels need to be replaced by other technologies, and that for me primarily means solar and wind power. And we're now in a situation where solar power, the price of solar power has plunged so much that electricity can be produced cheaper than it has ever been in history by any kind of fuel or technology by means of solar power. And I would welcome that. The problem is that the expansion in solar and wind that we see today in the world economy on the whole is not a replacement of fossil fuels. it's not it doesn't substitute for fossil fuels. It just adds to it. So you get more of everything. And for the climate, it doesn't matter how many solar panels, how many wind turbines you build, if you keep on burning the fossil fuels. The key is to stop burning the fossil fuels and replace them with another technology. Now, when it comes to direct air capture, the argument here that I make this in a very truncated form in this book, but I have a long article coming out with a colleague of mine in a research project on direct air capture and other kinds of drawdown technologies. And the argument here is that we already have emitted too much. There's already too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And we keep on increasing the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere by about 2 ppm per year right now. We're at 415 parts per million ppm, and it's increasing by about 2-3 per year. We have to stop that increase, but we also have to start to draw down the CO2, because it's not safe to live like this. As we see with the methane hydrates, or with wildfires in Australia and the Western US, or all of these extreme weather events that we've experienced recently, we've already left the safe space for humanity, and we have come perilously close to triggering those feedback mechanisms that might set runaway climate change in motion. This is what the methane, the melting of the methane, the activation of the methane hydrates would do. So we need to find a way not only to stop emitting, but also to take carbon dioxide down. And this idea has been around for quite some while. It's implicit in the name of one of the main organizations that built up the contemporary climate movement, namely 350.org. The idea that we need to go back to 350 ppm. How are we going to do that? Well, we can reforest areas, so reverse deforestation and expand forests that naturally soak up CO2. The problem is that that probably won't be sufficient to take everything back. For that, you need a technology that can reverse this accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere. And there are a few technologies that can do that. And the one that I'm writing a little bit about in the book, and that I've done some research on, and that you mentioned here, is direct air capture. And this is complicated, but the very basic, simple principle is that you have a machine that looks a little bit like a huge fan that sucks in air. It can be any air outdoors, because CO2 is mixed up in any air. You suck this air into the machine, and then there is a filter that is filled with what's called a sorbent. That's a chemical substance that reacts with CO2 and binds the CO2 molecules in this filter, while the other molecules in the air waft away. And then when the filter is saturated with CO2, you take it out and you heat it up, and then you get pure CO2 that you can pump away. And this technology in itself isn't very advanced or miraculous or mysterious or anything, because it's been used for a long time in enclosed spaces where you need to remove CO2, such as submarines and International Space Station and things like that. Now, I could talk for a long time about this technology, but to sum up the argument very briefly, what we should do with a company like Total, because this is on the agenda right now, because 350 and other climate movements are trying to mobilize against the catastrophic idea of Total going into the Arctic to drill up more oil. What should happen with a company like Total is that it should be socialized, should be taken from their private owners, put into public hands, and forced to stop completely producing fossil fuels, and instead start cleaning up the atmosphere and take the CO2 down. And use the equipment, the skills, the petrochemical knowledge, the workers that needs good jobs, and set them to a completely different task, namely to ensure a safe operating space for humanity by massively expanding direct air capture facilities and pump the CO2 into safe storage space underground. When I say that, you probably immediately think, well, where's that safe storage space going to be? And it sounds a little bit like nuclear power. We can go on and discuss these details. This is very briefly the general idea, and one that I think that the climate movement needs to push. Wherever you have fossil fuel companies that are privately owned, socialize them and make them stop producing fossil fuels and instead convert them into institutions for cleaning up the atmosphere. Yeah, that's the basic idea.
Okay, so now we do the break, and I'm happy to hear your questions after 10 minutes break.
Andreas. Oh, danke. Ich wollte nicht kommen, deswegen bin ich jetzt da. Ich muss noch arbeiten.
Ja. Also, ja. Genau.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I heard it. Yes, wonderful. Yes. Yes. So how do you feel about the second lockdown? How bad is it for you?
Well, I'm in hospice right now.
Yeah. Speaking of this, yeah.
I didn't know what happened.
Is it only the far right expresses that now?
No, it's not. You know, you see the mixes. And then before I just stopped a little bit. The most popular against it. They just see the movement. You see it's the front.
Latif och sånt? Nej, det är sånt här. Det är sant. Ta en taxi då. So the youngest lion on trampoline right now is student. The oldest is... Your kids are
9 and 10.
9 and 10. Do you have kids?
But it's a lot of demanding to say sleep.
Yeah.
But I love my
Oh, do you? What are the stickers say?
They say, your Van Allen, are you sure? Are you serious? The one is to be born.
Bomb?
In our school.
Really?
Yeah. Not born, but they still tired. Something is blew up.
Where in the city do you live?
In Prince Albert, a lot of it. Yeah. They're getting bigger.
Yeah.
But you lost the pipeline and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah, the book arrived today.
Yeah.
It's just in time.
But are you active as an activist or author?
I'm not an organizer, but I go to actions every day. I was actually planning to go to this action on Saturday against the airport.
Yes.
But I'm not sure I will make it. Since I was kid, I haven't been active as an organizer. I used to be. I go to New Zealand.
also the reason why I ended in another altar house.
Yeah, and the Glen is like the thing we in Sweden looked up to as the separateness.
But how do you feel about Sweden not being locked down?
How do I feel about it? I feel that it's wonderful not to have it.
Yes, okay. What do you think about it?
Yeah, well, that's another question. I mean, I have difficulties here because I know that, well, they do speak about what I might know, but some of my comrades in Sweden are very upset about the Swedish policy and think that Sweden is sacrificing vulnerable old people. But I'm not sure I agree. And nowadays it doesn't really seem that Sweden is that much worse than any other country.
Didn't have another.
It doesn't seem. I mean, the numbers are going up in Sweden now too, but I don't think it's worse than anything else.
Only also in the big cities, not in the big cities.
Yeah, I think so. But I think also it's quite. There is some part of the countryside up north that's quite bad. But do you know?
Yeah, my brother lives in Sweden.
He lives in Sweden. Where does he live?
Next to Åmål.
Next to Åmål.
Yeah.
What's the place he lives in?
Really?
That's where my brother lives.
What is the name of your brother?
Jonathan Malm.
Maybe
So he must be connected to Moskva.
Yeah.
What does he do?
He's a blacksmith, but he studied in Berlin-Brandenburg. It's next to
What's his name?
Justus? Yeah.
Have you been there?
Yeah. Every summer I'm there.
Every summer you're in a farm. That's incredible.
Yeah. I've been there in August for 2 weeks. Yeah.
But you know the bakery there?
Yeah. Sure. I know the bakery. Yes.
My brother's wife is one of the people.
Okay.
Yes.
But Jonathan,
yes.
Okay, but I'm sure my brother.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Okay. It's funny because I told him that today there's the event. Yeah, but my brother now works in
So he works as a blacksmith?
No, he's now like he makes social things for Volvo, and he starts as a blacksmith, but now he's getting old. It's really hard. It's fun. And then they wear no mask in summer, and also not in public transport, and so it's quite different. But I think we had to go on some tickets for concerts and to book time slots and
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of recommendations. I mean, now there are new recommendations because numbers are going up. So only take public transport if it's absolutely necessary. Don't go shopping unless you absolutely things like that. But it's not. Don't close them down.
But it's hard also with the close border with Denmark.
Yes.
Why?
Yes.
Is there a difference?
Yes. Denmark is
Still, people consume less, travel less.
Yes.
All this. The effect is really good.
Yes. It's a strange.
I just see what it does to the children. They're like little soldiers, putting all the masks in there. And please keep distance. It really changes for them so much.
But how is it in school now? In Berlin, do they have to wear masks? In school?
They have to wear masks
In school, but then if they go to the classroom, they have part of the courses washing hands. Half the course of the.
Already.
Yeah. Washing hands, they also line, washing the hands. It's really nice. And they do all this disinfection, the tables. For them, it's really. My daughter said, when will it be like before? I want to travel. I want to see Italy. Staying in the website is much better for the environment. planet for environment. Not for society.
Okay.
Okay.
You ready to take more questions?
Yeah.
So we go on.
I should have some paper. Do you have a little
Paper?
piece of paper?
I have some paper.
Maybe I can ask some. Thank you very much.
Okay, we go on, and I'm happy to hear your questions. And because we are not allowed to pass the microphone and we are on air, are we still on air for YouTube? Nobody tells me. Yes? Okay. So I will always repeat your question another time. Don't be irritated. And of course, you can also ask in German, and I will try to translate your questions. And so I switch to the moderator now. And yeah, we are back. So we are talking about Climax, the book of Andreas Malm. And actually, I really recommend reading it. It's beautifully written, and it has a very forcing and brilliant line of arguments. And so, yeah, please, does anybody have a question already? Yeah.
Also ich rede Deutsch, weil Englisch draußen. Ich weiß nicht, ob ich Sie richtig verstanden habe, als Sie vorhin dargelegt haben, die Technik, wo man CO2 filtern kann, und Sie haben finden das gut dort. Und ich frage mich, ob wenn man sich so fokussiert auf die technischen Lösungsmöglichkeiten, ob das nicht eine Gefahr ist oder schlecht ist, dass der Ärger, den Sie reklamiert haben, dass man sagt, naja, wir haben ja die Technik oder die Technik, die löst das und da brauchen wir nichts mehr weiter zu machen, dass es also gefährlich ist, auf die Technik zu setzen.
Okay. So she's interested in the direct air capture technology and asking if we concentrate on techno-fix, on solutions, maybe we lose the anger because we are hoping for technology to save us. What would you think about this?
So I answer immediately?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a good question. Now, as I said, the argument around direct air capture is very abridged in the book, and many nuances are lost. I hope this article that I mentioned will soon be out, where we discuss these issues at greater length and in depth. And you're absolutely right that there are risks and problems here. And when BP says that we'll be carbon neutral, they probably think partly about direct air capture. And you have cases of other oil companies, including ExxonMobil, promoting direct air capture. And their idea is that if we have a parallel infrastructure built up that takes the CO2 back down, then we can continue with oil and gas. Yeah. The idea being, yeah, again, I could go in a lot of depth here because we've studied how some of the scientists promoting direct air capture have argued that it's about emitting CO2 is like going to the loo, like going to the toilet, like peeing, basically, or pooing. You just need to build up a sewage system. So you need direct air capture that work like toilets that flush the waste products out of the atmosphere. This would be a disastrous development for a lot of reasons. Because partly it would be an extremely irrational way of using resources to maintain the infrastructure, even expand it to take up fossil fuels and burn them, and then build another equally big infrastructure to try to take that waste back down. But also, if you would manage to do that, which is very unlikely, to have both of those infrastructures in parallel, you wouldn't actually be reducing the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. For that, you need to stop emitting and then take the CO2 down. If you have an oil leak going on, a major oil spill, the first thing you do is you stop the leak and then you clean up. You don't continue with the leak and clean up at the same time and then just go on and go on and go on. Yeah. So that would be one of the things where a progressive approach to direct air capture would differ from the approach taken today by fossil capital. And the second very important distinction is the following. If you are a company that runs a direct air capture facility, I will abbreviate this DAC now because that's the abbreviation used in this business. If you have a DAC plant and you're an owner of a DAC plant, you produce a product which is pure CO2. When you have this product, you can decide if you want to bury it under the ground and thereby actually draw CO2 down from the atmosphere, or if you want to sell this product. So there is a facility in Iceland that actually buries the CO2 under the ground. But all other DAC facilities that operate in the world now have not gone down this path, but instead the owners, as any rational capitalists, use the resource they produce as a commodity that they sell. So the company that, for instance, I have studied, we went to one of their facilities in Zurich, in Switzerland. They capture the CO2, but then they don't bury it under the ground. They sell it to Coca-Cola, which puts it into their bottles as the fizz, and to a greenhouse where it fertilizes, where the concentrated CO2 is used to fertilize plants. And this company is now planning, together with a Norwegian company, to build a big facility for producing synthetic fuels that are supposed to drive airplanes. And you have DAC companies that are planning syn fuels for cars. And the logic here is simple. For a capitalist, you have to have a commodity that you can sell and make a profit from. Otherwise, you are not a capitalist, and you can't run your company because you don't make a profit. But if you bury the CO2 under the ground, you put it to the side and never touch it again, and it's extremely hard to see how that can be a commodity. What do you sell when you just put the CO2 back into the ground to never be used, never be touched again? So the argument we make here is that to actually realize the potentials of this technology, you need to go beyond the quest for profit. And as long as DAC as a technology is captured by capital, the potential of the technology will be lost. Because what these companies will do is they will sell the concentrated CO2 as commodities. So you have all these DAC companies that are experimenting, because the CO2 as a molecule, when you have it in concentrated form, you can process it, refine it in all sorts of ways through chemical industry. I'm not a chemical engineer, so I can't go into the details. But clearly, they can produce things like shoes based on those carbon molecules that are captured from the air. So there is all this new fancy business sector called air miners, where you have companies that want to mine the air and use the air, the CO2 that's in the air, as a raw material for virtually everything. You can build mattresses, you can build tires, you can build concrete, you can build virtually anything out of this CO2. Problem is, it's extremely expensive still, but they think that it will become cheaper and cheaper, and they will make more and more profit. My point here is that we should use this technology, but not to produce commodities, because that doesn't actually take any CO2 down. If I drink a bottle of Coca-Cola with CO2 captured by Climeworks, I will burp this CO2 up, and it will return to the atmosphere immediately. The only way to use the DAC technology as it should be used, namely to draw CO2 down, is to bury the CO2 under the ground. And the way that you do that is that you mineralize it. You turn the CO2 into a stone and bury it under the ground and never touch it again. But that requires something else than a profit motive. Because it's extremely hard. It's impossible to see how you can make a profit out of that, when the point of the stone is that it should never again be used. It shouldn't be consumed. It shouldn't be used as an input. It should just be put aside. So who can do this? Well, the only actor that you can see is the state or some kind of institution under public control that deals with this as a common property to clean up the common that is the atmosphere. Yeah.
Please, in the back.
Yes, thank you. Since you were asking for our thoughts on, the comparison between the COVID crisis and the climate crisis, I was just thinking about what are the things that you turn into events, right? On the one hand, you turn the climate crisis into one event, whereas you could also say, okay, Hurricane Katrina is one event.
Exactly, yes.
The forest fires. And then on the other hand, you have the COVID crisis, whereas you could also say, this unfolding chain of different epidemics in itself is a crisis.
Exactly.
And then maybe, I was just thinking, then maybe you have a different sort of timeline, and then maybe it starts in the global south as well, and only now...
Absolutely,
right?
You're absolutely right.
There was just one thought. I had a different question, which is, if we're talking about the state, right?
Yeah.
So this capture of state power is probably like a very classical communist trope. Like
yes.
We've tried it for 100 years.
Indeed.
And I think more than often the nation state has actually captured the communists and not the other way around.
Yeah.
Right? So I was thinking, like, why do we still trust this strategy? Why do we still trust the state? Whereas when, in relation to the climate crisis, in so many cases, the state is actually the perpetrator.
Sure.
Right? Especially from indigenous perspectives and so on and so on. So is it maybe not also time for the climate movement to start exploring, as grand as it sounds, like building other kind of institutions? Why do we still trust into the state so much?
And now I have to repeat some of what you said. So the question is, why do we still trust the state? And are there other institutions that the climate movement should build in order to change things?
Yeah.
Could you please take the microphone in your hand?
Me?
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry. So, on the state. I don't trust the state. I feel a fundamental mistrust against the state, the capitalist state, the states that we have. Although, in a sense, you can say that countries where the pandemic has been managed tolerably well tend to be countries with functional welfare states, in contrast to a place like Brazil, where you don't have an operational functioning welfare state, and people are just left to fend for themselves, and it doesn't work very well. Now, my argument here is that the climate crisis is now so deep and so severe and has been left unaddressed for so long that we need so radical measures that it's hard to conceive of anyone else than the state doing it. That doesn't mean that I trust that the state will do it. But if you want to cut emissions with something like 7 or 10% per year, that means that you impose regulations, rationing, planning, measures that look a little bit, in a sense, like the restrictions that we have now, where the state says, you restaurants will close from this day onwards. But it would look different. It would be the state saying, you electricity providers or whatever it is have to cut your emissions by 10% every year, or else we'll fine you. We'll punish you with heavy fines, with penalties, something like that. And likewise, if you have a situation with private fossil fuel producers that have to be put under control, to me, what that would mean would be something like the state taking those companies over and converting them to something else. Now, we could imagine building up other institutions doing this. We could imagine everything from Räte, from workers' councils, to a climate movement that grows big enough to do this, or, I don't know, strike movements in industry, or whatever kind of grassroots initiative it could be. And I would be in favor of all of that, But I think at the end of the day, if you have such phenomena cropping up, they would constitute themselves as de facto states when they start to impose things like 7 or 10% cuts per year, or socializing these companies. I mean, you can call it something else than the state if you like. You can call it the Federation of Workers' Councils or whatever you like. But in my mind, it would be a state in the sense that it would be an institution that uses coercive authority to actually compel fossil fuel producers and burners to cease doing this damage to the earth. And I don't see a way around that. I don't see I think that the issue has now reached such a scale that it's very hard to see that it can be solved by very local initiatives in neighborhoods where it's easy to set up decentralized, non-hierarchical structures, at least for some time. But the big problem here, and you're absolutely right, is that the states we have absolutely no reason to trust that they will do this. So the question would then be, how do we become the state, or how do we force the state to do what's necessary? I don't have any simple answers to these questions, because I don't think there are any simple answers. But these are the questions that we need to ask ourselves, I think. And perhaps most likely the question would be, how do we force the actually existing states to do this? Because exactly as you say, the left has tried for a century or even more to seize the power of the state and constitute other states, worker states or whatever, and it hasn't worked that very well so far. And it's quite unlikely that in the short time frame we have, the bourgeois state apparatuses that we have will be replaced by something like worker states. I don't see it happening, but I might be overly pessimistic. But I mean, I don't see that we're on the verge of an October Revolution or a November Revolution, 1918 here in Germany, in the very near future. But who knows?
Okay, more questions.
Actually, my question will be also a bit in the similar direction, but from kind of another look. So, like, I also remember that, like, you kind of in your this book, Progress of this Storm, think that you also defend propose a solution of like autonomism or also now recent to this eco-Leninism. But when we come to these things, then the war as a concept isn't now anymore a metaphor, but a real war. We are talking about like a class war or really war with guns and stuff. So, but like also we know from our past experiences in the last last century, in the last 100 years, that like imperialist core is very well prepared of this concept. Sure. And we see all this destruction of all these movements that also you talk in the book that, like, for example, with this like deforestation that started in the, I think, the 1980s in these peripheries, also to kind of destroy the basis of these movements that like this state seizing powers of communists or whatever. So I also don't see that like the point that how, you know, the Exxon CEO or like a Total CEO will, you know, just give away this also apparatus away. And from the point of, to take the question in a point of violence, how we will deal with this? And is there like, do you have any kind of, you know, a way to? I mean, I don't expect that you will suggest some people's protracted war, but like still.
So now we have a question about the war as a concept, not being just a metaphor, but becoming real, because he sees that there's a destruction of a lot of movements against deforestation. It has a long history that all these movements were destroyed. And why should the companies, the fossil fuel companies, give up their power?
Yeah, so the fossil fuel companies will not give up their power voluntarily and will not do it freely. They will have to, I mean, the companies will have to be taken from their owners and transformed into something else. But I don't think that this means literal war in our countries. I don't see I don't see what that war would look like. I mean, war, to begin with, war isn't something that you rush into and something that you embrace and desire. Actual war is a very bad thing, and I have difficulty seeing how we would even be capable of waging an actual, literal, concrete war against fossil fuel companies, because we in the climate movement have no arms, have no guns, and no one is considering that we should arm ourselves. It's not in our capacity. I don't even think it's in our interest. I don't think we can wage a struggle against any fossil fuel company with actual guns at this moment in time. I'm not a pacifist, so this book on pipeline is precisely about violence. So I don't say that in all cases we have to always refrain from using guns. That's not what I'm saying. But I don't see that as a viable path at this moment. Although you can't take cases. I mean, there was a recent case of a woman in South Africa, an activist against a coal mine that was shot and murdered. And you have environmental activists around the world in the global south being assassinated, murdered at an incredibly high rate that is rising. There it would make sense for those people to arm themselves in self-defense. From Honduras to South Africa to Indonesia, there's a very important class struggle going on in Indonesia against new initiatives to open Indonesian forests for complete deforestation by foreign investors and taking away rights for workers at the same time. So there have been these strikes and massive rallies, demonstrations in Jakarta and elsewhere in Indonesia in recent weeks that really combine environmental and labor struggles, because the Indonesian state and capitalist class just want to open up all the resources they have in nature and in the working class for foreign exploitation. But I would hesitate to, at this moment in our political conjuncture, even toy with the idea of that we're about to start an actual war. What we need to do is we need to massively step up the pressure and try to compel states by the kind of means that we can mobilize to push the state to do things, such as taking over a company like Total in France. Now, when you speak of class war and things like this, it's in a sense metaphorical, but it could also be concrete. So in France, just the other week, activists from Extinction Rebellion went into the affluent areas of Bordeaux and deflated the tires of about 220 SUVs. And you can see that as a kind of class war where you attack the properties of the richest people, precisely these kind of commodities, these machines that devastate the planet for no good reason at all. And you inflict, in this case, a very temporary damage by just deflating the tires on these cars. But in this other book, I advocate this kind of sabotage as something that we can do without any kind of arms involved. It's unarmed, completely unarmed sabotage. But you could also imagine things like, as the title says, blowing up pipelines, as activists that actually see this as a form of non-violence, even in the US, have done. But this would, as I see it, this would not be an actual war to defeat the enemy of fossil capital and take over those companies, as in we're marching with guns into the headquarters of ExxonMobil and Total and we socialize them. Rather, it would be part of the actually existing climate movement expanding and adopting a broader set of tactics, a spectrum that can include more than just the kind of fairly gentle civil disobedience that XR and others have conducted in recent years, and diversify into types of sabotage and more militant kind of action as social movements that are surging tend to do, just like the BLM movement did this year. I mean, if we should discuss violence, much of this other book, I don't know how much we should talk about this other book, but this other book is largely focused on the question of the role of violence in social movements, and there is an idea that that as soon as a social movement starts using violent tactics, it immediately alienates the masses and becomes unpopular and condemns itself to marginality and futility. This is strategic pacifism, the idea that as soon as a social movement uses violence, it goes downhill. But Black Lives Matter this year worked exactly the other way around. The movement was constituted as a mass movement when the people of Minneapolis entered the police station in the 3rd precinct, stormed it, and burned it to the ground. That's when people realized that the police in the United States is not above the law, and it's in our power to stop the systematic murder of black people by the cops. And then you had this explosion of popular mobilization, mostly peaceful, but also including things like toppling statues, damaging police cars, clashing with the police. A diversity of tactics that constituted this moment, the one big social movement of this year. And I think the climate movement needs a similar diversity to push its demands, but not to wage an actual war, because that's, I mean, it's not in the cards.
Another question.
Yeah, thank you very much. So my question is in regard of like the distinction, the Marxist distinction between maybe the sphere of production and the sphere of circulation or consumerism, if you want so. So like, as far as I'm concerned, the German discourse right now is really centered around like saving the environment by like consuming in an ethical way, like, I don't know, not flying as much as we're used to, buying locally grown vegetables and so on and so on. And you were speaking about like some sort of end of normal status quo when you went into like this big mall that was virtually empty. And I thought like, okay, this is the end of one of the two spheres. Like it's the end of consumerism, it was in a certain way. But we did not see this promised drop in like CO2 emissions. Like people flew way less, like they could not consume as much because like the shops were closed. We stopped consuming, but like the production did not stop in the way it should be. So like we still emit as much or almost as much CO2 as we did before. So like my question is, what is your opinion on the role of consumption as like a driver for climate change? And shouldn't we like focus more on like changing the way we produce things and what we produce?
Okay, I have to repeat the question again. We have a question asking if climate action today is framed as changing habits of consumerism and the end of consumerism. And so the question is, shouldn't we think more about production and not only consumerism, and also the comparison to Corona and was shown?
Yeah, so I mean, I will give a fairly orthodox Marxist answer to the question, and that is that the sphere of production is the determining one. That's where the drive to expansion originates, not in the sphere of consumption in itself. So the reason that Total wants to go into the Arctic, or ExxonMobil wants to put out 30% more oil in 10 years than it does now, is not because there is a massive popular demand for that product. It's because this is how those companies make a profit, and that's how they compete with each other. They are compelled as private enterprises to produce as much as they can and make maximum profit. Otherwise, they are, they would be shaken out of their sector. And it's the same with the beef companies that deforest the Amazon right now at a frightful pace. They want to produce more and more meat, and then it's a matter of also trying to sell, of course, these commodities, but precisely because the production moment is the determinant one, you have this inbuilt tendency in capitalism to produce more commodities than can be sold. And I think this is the problem that capitalism again faces in this crisis. that you have an excess of capacity, of productive capacity, and of commodities that cannot be realized because consumption has been curtailed by all of these restrictions. But you're right that just reducing consumption in this way doesn't really solve anything as long as the production sphere is left untouched. The interesting thing is that some sectors of capitalism right now, because of the pandemic, are in a crisis that also affects the sphere of production, including oil. So in Sweden, we've just had the most important climate, national climate struggle in a long time, where a Saudi-owned company, owned by a Saudi capitalist, applied for expansion of an oil refinery, I think the largest oil refinery in Sweden, that if this expansion would have been approved, this refinery would have turned to the single largest point source of emissions in Sweden. So a massive expansion of this refinery was planned. But the pandemic so reduced the oil price that it wasn't any longer necessarily profitable for the company to go through with this investment. And this, in combination with the popular mobilization against the plan, actually made the company shelve it. So this expansion will not happen. It's considered in Sweden one of the major victories of the climate movement in recent years. So this pandemic is, in a way, a moment when parts of fossil capital are weakened because the oil price is so low that some of these investments have to be shelved. And if we can use that as an opportunity to mobilize also as a movement, we can perhaps make some progress.
Okay, I think we can take one more question and then we come to an end. I can't see another question. And maybe I would like to bring up only one point. I was thinking when we had this discussion about, let's call it again, the fossil Luddites who go and throw up, blow up the pipeline. I was also thinking about Bürgerparlamente, so citizen parliaments as a measure. And actually there's a German movement called German Zero. They're trying just this, to put pressure on the German politicians by bringing up this citizen parliament to enforce a law which would mean neutral emissions until 2050 and also the steps until there. And I think all these things together are very important because it's also a question of the law. Yeah.
Yeah, my argument in this pipeline book is not that sabotage is some kind of panacea. The only thing that everyone should do, it's an argument developed largely in a critical dialogue with the theory that Extinction Rebellion has about how social change happens. According to Extinction Rebellion, you always have to be absolutely peaceful and never do anything else. I think some parts of Extinction Rebellion are revising this theory, and not the least the approach that XR has had towards the police. After BLM, it's quite difficult to continue to be so loving towards the police that XR used to be, or was in 2019. But yes, you're right. All of these initiatives are important, and I mean, I would never denigrate electoral campaigns. I mean, now we have Boris Johnson in the UK, and we have Trump, and in the best case, Joe Biden as the president of the United States. But we weren't that far from having Jeremy Corbyn as a prime minister in the UK. And there was a moment when we thought that maybe Bernie Sanders could actually become the Democratic candidate. So I wouldn't say that those campaigns were pointless. If we would have had Jeremy Corbyn as the Prime Minister of the UK now and Bernie Sanders as the Democratic candidate, we would have been in a completely different political situation. So electoral campaigns certainly have their part to play in the future too. Although one can, of course, become very depressed that it didn't work out. I mean, the Labour Party in the UK, the manifesto they put out for last year's election, it's a year ago right now, right? That manifesto was the best that I've ever read any major party in an advanced capitalist country put out, because they said all the right things about climate and had all the right policies, and still they lost, because nationalism always fucks everything up. Yeah.
So this is the final sentence for the evening. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you very much for having this conversation with us, and I wish you the very best for the next weeks. Take care.